Use case diagrams aren't necessarily code, and they're not really even technically designed, but they are a critical aspect of UML that helps to tell the story of our system. And so I think it's really important to have a good grasp on them because they're very, very powerful, but also need to be used appropriately. So a use case diagram is kind of like a menu of the system. You see this big menu board here. This shows you different categories of food that the restaurant has, the different things you can order. But what it doesn't show you is equally important. So it will tell us the things you can get from this restaurant. It even kind of implies the ingredients that are in it to some degree, but it's not the recipe for making it. It doesn't show the decisions that get made behind the scene by the cook to create these things, or the flow of how the food transforms from raw ingredients to the final product. This is not, as I said, a design piece. The main point of a use case is to show the interaction between an actor and your system as defined by a use case. The use case diagram literally then uses actors as stick figures or other little pictures. There's a lot of flexibility in that. And use cases typically are these ovals. And the main point of a use case is to show which actors can access which use cases. You have these little lines that show this accessibility, what things people are allowed to do and what they can access. So as a very simple example, here we see a teacher who goes off to the system and writes a test. And then the student can take the test and the teacher can grade the test and both the teacher and the student can see the results. So this tells us a few things. My software system has to have features out there for teachers to create tests, for students to take tests, for teachers to grade tests, and for both of them to see the results. So it gives me an idea of what my system builds and does for people. And it also gives me a notion of accessibility and maybe even security, if you will. Who can access what and who do I need to talk to? I don't care when I'm writing tests what the students think of it one way or the other. I want to know what teachers think of it. The same sort of thing. The teachers may or may not care about how students take tests. They might have some care, but they're not the ones using it directly. So I definitely want to have student involvement in defining this. Now, further use case diagrams lets us show even more information by adding in boundaries. So the idea of a package in a use case defines some sort of boundary in which a use case applies. So for example, I could say that taking a test can only happen in a classroom as opposed to being online, doing it somewhere else. So that gives me some really good information that, hey, the computers I have to be classroom computers. They don't have to be installed by the student, and they can have easier login access. Or I know that when the student logs in, they have to use their school account or something like that, as opposed to the course management system, which is the place where I see results. Writing the test, grading the test, I don't necessarily have to have everything live inside of one of these boxes, but I can put actors inside of the packages, or I can put use cases inside the package just to show where things live and where they behave and how they interact with the system. Again, I could put the student inside the classroom, but obviously the student is allowed to access CMS from outside the classroom. But maybe my system only cares about students when they are in the classroom, especially if you're talking about public schools and elementary school systems. Kids aren't allowed to log in on their own separately, perhaps, and I can show that representatively. So the packages are really important to describing in an instant, visually, the boundaries of my system and what they are. So let's come back to a second about the idea of what is a use case. I said, a menu of what a system does is a little bit vague. So using this definition by a guy named Alistair Coburn, he says that a use case is an interaction between a user and a system that typically lasts between 15 to 20 minutes, 5 to 20 minutes, excuse me, and most importantly, adds some value to both the user and the system. So it's not just simply a single step, a single line of code, or something that happens in a few milliseconds, though it could be something that happens very quickly. It typically is going to be a more involved interaction. So just simply pressing a button is not necessarily good enough for a use case. It's going to be the whole process of what form do they see and what do they put in and what are the errors that might show up from validation errors, or what are the a wizard, 4 or 5 different steps they might be doing in. So sometimes you'll see examples of use cases which are not necessarily great use cases. So things like login. From Coburn's description, login is too short, too simple, and really adds no value. Yes, you'll always see a login use case because they're useful for documenting things like that. They capture the rules of it and whatnot. But for the most part, they're not really a true valuable use case. Another mistake sometimes is to get really specific, like having a use case of saving something to the database. Well, this is too technical. This is a byproduct of the system design that you're having. I don't know about databases. Users don't need to know about databases. That's too much in the weeds. And sometimes you can be also equally too abstract. So something like sending an email or a notification, these are not business goals. You need to be more specific. You might notify a user that their account is past due. Well, that's a business goal. That's a business transaction. The user finds that valuable because they're going to have late penalties. The business finds it valuable because they want to be paid. So you shouldn't have a technical feature just simply like sending a notification or an email, but that should be tied to some business goal. That's what a use case is. It's that boundary between where people come in and where the system starts behaving. So let me talk about some examples of good use cases. Something like registering for a class, like we talked about in a different example. There's several steps that's critical for everybody involved. Students need to take classes. The university needs people to sit in their classes. Or checking out a purchase. So this may or may not include the shopping phase. It's kind of depends on the complexity of your system, but simply searching for a product might not be a very good use case. It doesn't. I mean, people can search products all day long. It adds no value to the business. Might be valuable for the window shoppers, but you might want to have the whole sequence there. How do I search? How do I check things out? That might be a more appropriate use case. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a user interaction. I could have some sort of batch monthly report where there's not a human involved up front, but the process is rich, has many steps. It's gathering data from many places. It's leading to a valuable product at some level. So don't think that use cases are too limited, but also don't think that they're there to define the system. So going back to Coburn and his description, he calls appropriate use cases this idea of a C-level use case. So he says the first mistake is writing use cases up in the clouds. They're very high level and vague. The first mistake people often make is they define interactions between users, or they tell users what they should be doing. And that's a bit of a mistake because your software system doesn't get to do that. That's occasionally appropriate for a few use cases when somebody's defining a business process. But for software systems, I don't want to talk at those high levels because it doesn't tell me enough detail about my system. It sometimes becomes hard to find out where my system is. The other mistake is to go underwater with your use cases, submarine use cases, if you will. That's the places where I'm talking about databases and back-end interactions and login rules and stuff like that. What we really want to do is write use cases that are at what's called C-level, that they live right at the interaction of users entering data and seeing feedback from the screens or from the touch apps or from the video games or from the embedded devices or maybe even from batch jobs, because that gives us this best sense of what the system does, what the users want in that interaction back and forth. So again, the purpose of the use case is not to design your system, it's to define your system and what the system's value proposition is and how to split up the different things your system does so you can define those behaviors in the rest of your design.